Well, it didn't take very long for even Donald Trump's own voters to sour on him. Less than 2 years into Trump 2.0, and the vast majority of all Americans are completely fed up with the rising costs, spurred by what may be Donald Trump's greatest political betrayal of all time, starting a war in the Mideast with no clear or easy way to get out. A new analysis by Yahoo Finance finds this, quote, "You're not imagining it. Everything is expensive. The conflict with Iran this year has pressured prices even further. Gas prices are nearly $1 higher than a year ago. A typical 16-item basket of groceries compiled by Yahoo Finance was 41% higher in July than the same month in 2019, far outpacing overall inflation. That inconvenient truth continues to drive Donald Trump's poll numbers down ever lower and lower and lower. A new poll by Politico finds that 56% of Americans view the high cost of living as the most important issue facing the country today, followed by 29% of people who say the poor state of the economy is the top issue. They're laying the blame directly at Donald Trump's feet at this point. When asked about the failures of Trump's presidency, 36% say cost of living, 27% say the economy more broadly, 23% say it's Donald Trump using the presidency to enrich himself, and 21% say it's Trump's tariffs. And if Trump is looking for good news in any of this, you might want to change the channel right about now. When asked about the successes of Trump's presidency, the number one answer, the number one response at 36% was, none of these have been successes. And the anger isn't confined to feelings held by Democrats and independents. Politico writes this about these poll results, quote, "The results reveal an urgent warning sign for Trump as Republicans try to keep his winning coalition intact ahead of November, and new indications of where among the very voters that helped elect him in 2024. The issue cutting most sharply against Trump is also the one voters, including his own, say matters the most, and it has been for months." One Republican strategist telling Politico this, quote, "For gas prices, it's hard to find a more visible or salient indicator of prices than them, right? I think voters, they're drawing a pretty direct line between a closed Strait of Hormuz because of a war to higher gas prices. And, I don't know if there's a way around that right now. As the war puts pressure on Americans' finances, Iran manages to humiliate Donald Trump on the world stage. A threat forced him to be smuggled inside a catering truck with his Diet Coke valet alongside him, behavior more associated with a bootleg Imelda Marcos. Iran is now openly taunting Donald Trump, saying the war will not end anytime soon, with Tehran vowing to prolong the war until Donald Trump is out of office. The Trump economy putting renewed pressure on him to end the war, as Iran promises to keep fighting, is where we begin today with two of our favorite friends. Publisher for The Bulwark, host of the Focus Group podcast, Sarah Longwell is here. Also joining us, political analyst, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller is here. It's so nice to have both of you. Thank you.
What's up, girl?
I want to start with the Bush line because, Sarah, I think you said this to me when I had you on my podcast. And I lived through the Bush line. Like 32% means you can't really land Air Force One in normal political times. It means nobody wants you in the district because they don't want the local coverage and the coverage of their constituents seeing you with a politician at 32%. Trump is now not just flirting with 32, he's sort of squatting right on top of it in Quinnipiac and AP and a bunch of polls. And I wonder, in your view, one, if it's the floor, and two, if you see anything changing in our body politic now that he's at that number.
I definitely don't think it's the floor. What you're seeing actually is the numbers, they're all bouncing around a little bit, but they're all bouncing around at a lower place. But the aggregate right now has them around 38%. And when I talk about the Bush line, what I mean is I want those aggregates of all the polls to be down at 32% and lower. And the reason that the Bush line is so important to me is that when Bush left office, right, with his low approval rating because it was an unpopular war and a bad economy, the Republican Party at that point was able to be essentially hijacked by Donald Trump and these outside forces because there was like a weakness from when Bush had left office, right? A perception that he'd left office and it wasn't a successful second term. And it's important that Americans see Donald Trump and the MAGA experiment as a failure, not just so that we don't repeat what happens with Donald Trump, but also so that everything that Trump touches from here on out, the people that were in his administration, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, that their political futures are imperiled by their association with Trump and this administration. And so that's why Trump being that low, but it also matters for 2026. I mean, there is a direct correlation between the low approval rating of the sitting president for that party having a poor outcome in the midterms. And so we want Donald Trump to be as low as possible going into the 2026 elections, because that will enable sort of that blue wave to crest. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing so many polls come out showing individual matchups in the swing states between Democrats and Republicans, you're seeing the Democrats start to really pull away, is that the environment is tainted by Donald Trump, by the fact that Republicans have nothing to run on, nothing optimistic to run on. What are they going to talk about? The reflecting pool, the arch, the ballroom? These are Trump's obsessions, and Republican Congress people or senators, they can't run on that. And so Trump being unpopular, it also diminishes enthusiasm among Republican voters. So you get this enthusiasm gap between Democrats who will crawl over broken glass to vote for their candidates and a Republican base that's like, well, I don't need to show up. This is nothing's going well and I'm not happy with how things are going. So I think that's the national environment that these numbers are creating.
What's interesting to me is that this is the point, I think, 9 years in, where the political strategy is the best bulwark, not to use your name, but the best prophylactic against authoritarianism. Right? Like, it's the first moment where there's a political solution right there on the table to grab to protect the country from becoming a straight up authoritarian structure in terms of political prosecutions and a military not accountable to Congress or the military. I mean, this is that moment. And I wonder, Sarah, if that's coming up in focus groups.
Oh, Nicole, every time I'm on, I always want to tell you so badly that the American people are shuddering at this authoritarian power grab. But of course, that's not really the way that voters are experiencing it. Instead, what is happening is they're saying, look, we hired this guy to do one thing. We hired him to lower prices. He promised he would lower prices. And not only do we not have prices that are lower, but he has done specific policy things, namely tariffs and the war in Iran, both of which are increasing costs, keeping inflation high, and doing the exact opposite of what voters wanted. Now, that's voters in general. I will say on the Democratic side, to your point, and I think you're seeing this in the way that Democrats are really unifying after what are these incredibly toxic, bruising primaries, is them saying, this is our best chance to put a check on Trump in terms of what he is doing. And I think that what Democrats have learned is that they should talk less about authoritarianism and instead talk about the things that allow them to win elections so that they can curb the authoritarianism that we're seeing. And I think that that's actually a pretty good impulse.
Tim, tell me how you see the moment.
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything Sarah said. I would add a couple of points to it. I do think that there's a little, that you are seeing this galvanizing force on the Democratic side. And some people certainly are motivated by seeing, feeling like they have agency to stop this authoritarian takeover. And I think if you look at these primaries, all this focus, for example, in Michigan and Wisconsin on kind of the factional dispute on the Democratic side. One thing that I think was undercovered that struck me was just absolutely gargantuan turnout in both of those primaries.
Massive, yeah.
On the Democratic side, and much smaller turnout on the Republican side. I mean, like the losing candidates in the Michigan and Wisconsin races, I think would have won every, just in raw vote total, would have won every Democratic primary in the past decade in those states, right? So, I think you are seeing that for sure. The reason why Trump has to get his numbers lower, and why I think it's important for the Democrats to keep being aggressive, particularly on prices and the way that the stupid war has contributed to higher prices, is that if you look at that number that Sarah said, the 38% number versus 32, this is going to be a very meaningful difference in the Senate, in the key Senate states. Like the states where the Senate will be decided most likely: Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Alaska, maybe some others. But if you just look at those four, Trump won them by about 11, 12, 13 points. So he was about, call it 10 points higher than than he was nationally in those states. So if he's at 38, that means he's probably at like 48 or 47 or 46 in those key states. And that makes those races very competitive. If he's down at 32, and he's in the low 40s in those states, that makes those states very winnable for James Talrico, Sherrod Brown, Josh Turek, Mary Peltola, who are all running really good races in those four red states. And so, to me, I think that is like the political job of the Democratic Party, the pro-democracy movement, is how can you communicate to that? How can you take his number down from where it is even lower, and talking to people who are Trump voters? And to me, that's focusing on the betrayal and making sure that they tie the higher costs that they're experiencing to Trump's choices directly.